Yes, you can avoid JavaScript and instead use Rust for web frontend. And the developer experience is actually kind of good. In this video I'm going to show you how to create this QR code generator and how to publish it for free using GitHub pages. We start off by creating a new cargo project, and then we add Dioxys. And we can jump straight into the main.rs file. We can just include the entire preload of Dioxys, which just brings all the common types, interfaces and functions into scope. So in Dioxys, the main function just launches the main component, and you usually call the main component app. Now already, what the heck, this is kind of weird Rust syntax. Like, this is a function with an uppercase, and it has this component macro above it. So if you allow me, just let me cook a bit. Here we have a complete Dioxys app. If you open a new shell and install the Dioxys CLI, this has generated some HTML for us. So in Dioxys, you can create components by creating functions that return the element type. And a really easy way to create elements is with this RSX macro. I think it might be familiar to people who know JSX. Now what exactly was generated here? In all honesty, it's kind of a mangled DOM. We can see we have a body, and actually this stuff is because I'm serving it. So we get these nice toasts when events happen with the server. But here we have a div with ID main, and here is the contents of our RSX macro. So inside RSX, you can type code that's kind of similar to HTML, but you don't use the XML style tags. You use brackets to open and close elements. And something that's pretty awesome is that when you're doing stuff inside the RSX, Dioxys can very often hot patch the HTML. So if you see here, I add some more stuff. It was actually able to live update the HTML. That's pretty awesome for development. Now maybe first things first, let's get rid of this white background. To do this, we're going to add some CSS. We can use the built-in style sheet element that's pointing to our asset. If we're using the asset macro like this, it's trying to find the style.css in our project root, but we don't have it, so we have to create it. And if you want to pick like a cool dark color. Alright, it's time to figure out how we can generate a QR code in Rust. The great thing about doing this in Rust is that you have access to a lot of crates. I happen to know that this crate is kind of good. I've used it before. We're not going to be generating any raster images, but SVG instead. So we can pick no default features, but add the SVG feature. Fuck. Okay. From this monster command, we're creating a QR code, and we're panicking if the data is too much. So maybe we can change that later. And then we're rendering this into SVG, and it's using a builder pattern. So we can add some more options here later, but for now we're just building. And this gives us a string. So we have the SVG string. How do we show it in our HTML? Well, you might be tempted to just... But you can't use strings like this. You have to put them in a component. Or you can actually escape back to Rust syntax by wrapping it in braces like this. But this is not what we want. We actually get the SVG escaped as text. So we want to actually interpret this as HTML, which is a dangerous thing to do. Because this string, you know, it could have been generated by a user or something. Dioxys doesn't want you to do this, but you can do it. What you can do is create a container and then use the dangerous inner HTML attribute and then give your string. So this will actually be rendered as the HTML now. Cool. Now this is kind of boring. We want to add some reactivity to this. So instead of hard coding this hello, we can create an input. Here we have the input, and we want to change this string every time the input changes. So now we're going to introduce some reactive stuff. Let's create a signal. Let's create a signal for the input value. And the way you create signals in Dioxys is you give it a closure which can be ran to create the initial value of the signal. So right now I just want an empty string on startup. And then let's bind this value to our input. Just create an inline closure that is run every time the input is changed. So on input, you can create a closure then that acts on the input event. On input, you want to set the value of input value to the value of the input event. It's complaining because we're trying to mutate the signal. So we just have to make it mute. Well, did it work? Well, it's hard to see. We can check this by creating a use effect where we just debug print. But now the Rust compiler is not so happy with us because it needs the input value to outlive static. It thinks we want to borrow the signal, but actually, I can't speak for certainty, but it seems like Dioxys has sort of wrapped everything that has to do with signals, memos and stuff in a sort of arc. And it does the sheep clones for you. But when you need to hook into stuff, you actually need to capture an old signal into the closure. Okay, how can we see this info output? Well, you can see it both in your command line and also in the normal JavaScript log. This use effect is run every time input value is changed. It's hooked into input value. That's great. The next step, to generate this QR code from input value, we need to derive state. And the way you do that is to use the use memo. And you also give it a closure. And here, we want to use the input value signal. And same here, we need to actually capture a signal. So we use the move keyword. All right, and there we go. The QR code is being regenerated every time we change the input value because the input value is a signal and the QR code SVG derives state from that signal. But how does it know how does use memo and use effect know what signals to subscribe to? Well, it has to do with this syntax. It's like I'm calling the input value as a function. But you have to do this if you want to subscribe to signals. Well, okay, is this worth it? Or should you just use React? First, let's look at the size of this thing. Now, at first, this doesn't look very promising because the WASM file is roughly 32 megabytes. But remember, this is a dev build. So let's try running it in release build. And there we go, that decreased it a lot. So now it's down to roughly 500 kilobytes. That's kind of doable, right? Now this web app is entirely a static site, so we can deploy it to, for example, the GitHub pages or GitLab pages. I'm going to show you how to do it for GitHub pages. We create a workflow. I think this is a pretty reasonable workflow. So when we push to the main branch, this will be ran. The job needs to have these permissions to publish. First we check out, then we install the Rust toolchain, and we also specifically have to add the WASM target because Dioxys compiles the WASM. I also add this for good measure because it caches the dependencies for you, so the next time this workflow runs, it will be much faster. We need the Dioxys CLI to run the next command, which is the dx bundle. After this command, we will have the directory public, so that the directory will upload to the pages. Now let's run the bundle command ourselves. It creates the public directory. So the HTML is kind of sparse. This is a single page application. So we can see here we have some assets and it's adding all this hash stuff to, I think, to cache bust basically. Let's publish this to GitHub. To use GitHub pages from a workflow, you have to go into the settings of the repo, pages, and then change this to GitHub Actions. Now let's see, the workflow started. So it already has the toolchain and it's installed the Dioxys CLI and it's compiling. Right. And we have our first problem, shit. Because now Dioxys is trying to look for assets starting from the root path. So we need to add this to our deploy command. Here with -- base path. Let's see, that should be a lot faster. Alright, 44 seconds, that's kind of good. And it works. Now it correctly looks for assets under our base path. And the web app looks and works just fine. Now the transferred size of the WASM program is only 230 kilobytes. That's awesome. I don't know if this is production ready, but I think it's really cool to use Rust on the front end. Let me know what you think.